Welcome to News in Context. I'm Gina Valeria. It's no secret that polarization is deepening divides across the U.S. And over the past few years, many people have started or joined what are called bridging organizations to try and bring people together across those divides and help people bridge their differences by cultivating relationships, helping us see each other's humanity, and connecting on commonalities. The hope is that this helps us work together to solve the problems in our communities and society. This is Civity Week on News in Context. Civity is a culture of deliberately engaging in relationships of respect and empathy with others who are different, moving people from us versus them to we all belong. My guest is Graham Bodie, professor of integrated marketing communication at the University of Mississippi and chief listening officer with Listen First. Listen First is also a bridging organization, but it focuses on elevating the impact, visibility, and voice of other organizations doing bridging work. We explore how Listen First brings bridging organizations together and works to bring more people to the experience of connecting across difference, and scales the work of bridging divides in communities across the U.S. We also discuss the act of listening itself and the importance of learning how to listen, as well as what listening looks like in different contexts. Okay, let's start with your title, Chief Listening Officer. That's something you don't hear every day, and it's pretty awesome. So what does that mean? What is your role with Listen First?
The Listen First Project is a 501c3 that operates as a backbone organization for the collective impact network that we call the Listen First Coalition. 450 organizations across the country that do the work of depolarization and teaching people the skills and providing them the resources and opportunities to connect across difference. And so what my job as Chief Listening Officer is to hold meetings with the leadership of those organizations. And I'm always tuning my ears to the language they're using and the degree to which that language resonates with other organizations that are already in the coalition. I am always looking for opportunities to plug in new organizations and find ways in which we can mobilize and incentivize collaboration among organizations.
When you're listening to organizations, what are some of the things you're looking for to connect with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I'm listening for the kind of bucket within which that organization might fall. So as you might imagine, 450 organizations, there's a pretty wide degree of variability. So whether they're a traditional kind of hosting conversations organization like a Braver Angels, a Living Room Conversation, organizations that bring people together to talk across difference, or they might be more of a NICD Common Ground Committee that produces content, so Common Ground Committee podcasts and other events, finding common ground over potentially divisive issues, or they might be a news scraping or conversation scraping organization that looks at what are the conversations people are having, or what are the ways in which news media are more or less biased and therefore potentially contributing to mis or disinformation. So those are just three example buckets that I might be listening for to say, oh, okay, you did this kind of work, and so you might best partner with this kind of organization, or you're looking for an organization that does, that reaches college students. We've got organizations like Bridge USA that has chapters at colleges, so that would be a good person to reach out to. So I'm always just listening for what's the kind of work that these organizations do, how they prefer to do their work, and how they might find themselves sort of productively collaborating and co-creating things with other organizations.
So you're basically bridging organizations in a way.
You could say it that way, yeah.
We've talked about your role and what you do, and you've alluded to it throughout, but let's really get into Listen First. What is the goal of Listen First?
The goal of Listen First is the reduction or elimination of toxic polarization. So we want to shift societal beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors toward bridging. So we want to encourage people to take on the identity of a bridger by listening first to understand. So we want to normalize that behavior in society. From the standpoint of the umbrella or the backbone organization, our goal isn't necessarily to grow. In other words, we don't want 1,000 organizations by this time next year, but we do want to invite and include a diverse set of organizations, some of which sort of immediately recognize themselves as and brand themselves as and message themselves as bridging organizations, and those organizations that are doing bridging work, but if you told them they were a bridging organization, they would look at you sideways. And so, how do we remain or perhaps become more relevant to more organizations that either currently utilize bridging to service some other goal? So, we have all these social justice organizations that use bridging. How do we include them in the Listen First Coalition, or at least in the campaigns that we're running as part of the backbone organization for the coalition? Or if they don't feel like they can be included in the coalition for one reason or another, if it doesn't quite match their short, medium, or long-term goals, then how do we work with them, alongside them, or behind them in order to help them achieve the goals that they can achieve through the work of bridging? But that work, again, is ultimately in the service of societal change. First and foremost, our North Star is the way in which we treat each other, and we want the treatment of other human beings to be human, as opposed to stereotypes, or other modes of flaming each other on Facebook or whatever the case might be.
Civity is similar in a way that we're not bridging organizations doing that work, but we're working with organizations inside communities to help them bridge whatever divide it is that they face.
Your focus on local communities, I think, is imperative. We believe that there's no such thing as a national movement to reduce toxic polarization without a commitment to that work in local communities. And so, although our theory of change definitely includes national messaging and big, splashy national campaigns and events and all these kinds of things, that kind of work really is only additive or only generative if you have local people, leaders, and community members doing the work of community development and peace building at the local level. And so, any organization, Civity included, that works with various organizations at that local level, probably building coalitions and building the infrastructure at those local levels to allow citizens spaces to feel heard. We believe that work is vital and is crucial to the overall goal or North Star of reducing toxic polarization in the public sphere.
As you were talking, you brought to mind there's no national movement without local efforts, right? But how do you think about the idea of scalability? Going community by community is important and it's where the work needs to be done. But that idea of scalability becomes, when you're going one person at a time or one small group at a time, scalability can become challenging. So how do you all think about that?
The main way we have thought about, or at least the main way we have attempted to show the possibility of scalability, is through big national events like our America Talks National Week of Conversation that we run every year. And so, National Week of Conversation, we held our 5th annual this year, as an opportunity for organizations to do what they do during a particular week. It happens to be around April every year, for organizations to do what they do during that week, so that at scale, in other words, instead of having one organization doing one event during a week, we have hundreds of organizations doing hundreds or thousands of events, or offering thousands of activities and engagement opportunities for Americans to see, oh, there's all kinds of ways in which I can engage in this kind of work, right? So, in other words, at scale, we can get journalists and other media outlets interested in the work if we can show there's lots of people doing lots of things kind of at the same time. And then America Talks is the kickoff event, or was this year the kickoff event to National Week of Conversation, which is another model of scaling, which is utilizing a purpose-built online platform to automatically match the people that show up across some dimensions of difference, put them in a room together, whether that's one-on-one or in a small group, and provide them an experience that mirrors what they might experience if they were to do this kind of thing in their local community, but with people that are all over the country, with an appetite for a different kind of experience than what they think or what they've experienced happening before, which is sharing their perspective and being shot down or canceled or otherwise, afraid to share their perspective or afraid to interact with someone who voted for quote unquote the other guy, to give them that opportunity to have a meaningful exchange that doesn't turn into some, big yelling match, right? So talking about community development work at scale, it is you go and you pilot something in a city, and then you say, here's how that could work in other cities like this city or other communities like this community. And I think a great example of that coming out of America Talks National Week of Conversation is working with libraries. How can libraries be sites for community development and civic engagement? Every community has a library. Most community libraries are spaces that aren't white or black, Republican or Democrat, old or young, but are community spaces. And so how do we utilize those community spaces for the work of bridging, and how do we scale that across multiple libraries in multiple cities and localities, again, so we can turn that tide of rancor and limit that impact of toxic polarization on our civic spaces.
I love that. I'm on the board here at our Friends Library in San Francisco at the Friends, and it's the greatest thing because you're right, libraries are such a special place. So you talked about polarization, and you mentioned red-blue, but you mentioned additional divides across race, across age, et cetera. I know that at Civity, we talk about socially salient differences, trying to not necessarily take up the red-blue space because that space is very represented by other bridging organizations. Are you finding that that is the biggest, or are there other sort of differences that you see in your work that are coming through as in need, or as people are desiring to bridge?
Absolutely, the red blue is kind of the go-to or the main focus, and not for bad reason. A research study recently showed that the political identity or political ideology has dwarfed other markers of difference, including race, education, socioeconomic class, for that identity marker that most divides people in today's atmosphere. So it's an important, but it isn't why I got into this work, and it isn't what maintains me in this work. So we also have organizations, and there are other examples of organizations that aren't part of the coalition that do really great work across racial divisions, urban-rural divisions, and then generational, Gen Z and millennials versus other generations. So the bridging space could do a better job of diversifying the kinds of people that we draw. So we draw largely sort of older, bluer, likely to be female, living in urban spaces, blue, progressive. And so we don't do as good of a job in rural spaces, conservative spaces, younger spaces, non-white spaces, and so forth, right? But those people are important.
You're listening to News in Context. I'm Gina Valeria. We're talking with Graham Bodie, Chief Listening Officer with Listen First.
We also don't do a good job, which we found out this last America Talks, that we tried to rectify with ASL or hearing impaired individuals, other developmental and disabilities that disallow people to fully engage in quote unquote normative spaces. And so that's a point of growth and a point of diversity that we want to emphasize as well, is making sure that people with all kinds of abilities are able to feel included and participate in this kind of work. And it's hard, particularly with relying on technology, because going back to your question about scaling, if you're going to scale these kinds of things, you do have to rely somewhat on technology, or you've got a really large budget to fly people around the world, around the country, or train local facilitators. So there's cost benefit analysis in terms of using technology, but then also recognizing that technology utilization isn't universal, and we have pretty wide gaps that mirror other gaps in our society that we've got to be aware of, and therefore be always mindful as we're trying to scale that we're not scaling beyond our capacity to reach a diverse sort of a range of people with a range of experiences and ideologies and so forth.
That's such an important point. You talked about that's not the reason you got into it. And I had wanted to ask you, what did draw you to this work?
So my PhD is in human communication. I focus specifically on listening in close personal relationships. And what drives my research is providing complexity or nuance around what it means to be a quote unquote good listener. We've got 10,000 articles. You put what is a good listener in Google, and you can read till you fall asleep. And most of that advice is very simple, like maintain eye contact, be quiet, paraphrase, ask questions. But then they never tell you how to do any of those things. And they never recognize the fact that good listening is contextual. So how I listen when I'm in a conversation with someone who disagrees with me ought not look the same as how I listen to my daughter when I pick her up from theater camp in about 30 minutes, or to my wife, later this evening when I'm asking her about her day, or to, Fox News or MSNBC when I'm trying to get a quote unquote different perspective of a particular news story, right? So I came into this work wanting to kind of quote unquote scale more complex models of training in what I call listening intelligence. And I find a pretty stark application in trying to listen to people who come from vastly different worldviews and life experiences that happens to be politically motivated. I always say, like, I don't care about politics. I don't really want to ever live in a world where politics runs my life. But the fact is that politics runs our lives right now, for better or worse, if we let it. And so how do you provide everyday Americans with those skills and resources in order for them to think differently about themselves as listeners, and to, not just kindergarten, turn on your listening ears, crisscross applesauce, mouth shut, whatever. Nothing wrong with those pieces of advice. It's just they don't go far enough to allowing us to really be the kinds of listeners that we can be, and acknowledging that we'll never be perfect. It's an ongoing, lifelong learning experience. As somebody who, I always joke, like, my wife and I are both PhDs in communication. So students are oftentimes, oh, you must be great, communicators. Like, well, I know what I should do, and I know when I make mistakes how to correct them. It doesn't mean that I always do what I know I should do, and it doesn't mean that I always know what I'm supposed to do. But in hindsight, I can go back and I can analyze that from 40,000 feet, and I can use different kinds of words and phrases and vocabulary to help analyze the problems I'm having in my marriage or with my kids or with a coworker. And I can diagnose that and then create solutions around that, and therefore change my behavior. And so I want to help other people be their own sort of consultant, life coach, sort of listening coach. Give them that vocabulary, give them those analytical skills, and provide them with the case studies and the examples and the activities, right, to help them, become better listeners. And if it helps in the political domain, awesome. But that's not where it stops necessarily for me.
I love that. That's great. And I appreciate, the breaking down of listening. And to me, it's analogous in my head to the breaking down of the word love, right? In Greek, they have different words, but we don't have that. And I also appreciated this lesson of, you're not always going to do it well or right or correctly, but do you have the tools to analyze it and go back and correct what you can and move forward in a different way? And I think that's really important as well. In this context of a podcast, talking to each other across a computer, do you have any other tips or tools you can offer to people that would make sense in this context?
My fundamental assumption is that there are primary habits that drive our listening. And we've developed those habits much like we've developed habits in other domains of our lives. Some that are generative and productive, and others that might be impeding our ability to be sort of, our fullest potential, human self. And so for any given way in which you've been socialized over your life to listen, it's worked for you in many ways, right? It's given you some advantages or some strengths that allow you to be an adequate or a competent listener in many domains of life, right? And that same set of habits that you have toward listening, how you show up as a listener, there are challenges. There's barriers that are in place. There are both internal barriers, things that are happening inside of you, that you can control potentially, as well as external distractions and barriers that are outside of you that you might not necessarily be able to always control. And that's unique for kind of every individual, right? So all of that to say, listening well is first and foremost a self-awareness activity to figure out how you show up as a listener. And once you have that awareness and that vocabulary about how you show up as a listener, what your tendencies are, how you tend to ask questions, how you tend to respond to other people's questions, and so forth. Once you have that awareness, then you can, second step, begin to shift those habits and listen differently based on the situation, the person you're talking to, and so forth. And then the final step is to start to size up how other people are showing up as listeners. What kind of habits do you think are driving other people? And so that you can better speak into a variety of listening habits and be more effective in the kinds of impact that you want to have with people. So if you know somebody is coming to the interaction with a certain set of habits, you can structure your agenda, your meeting, your PowerPoint slides, or just the way in which you approach them in conversation differently, so that you can be the most resonant and the most impactful. And it's that kind of again, shifting from thinking of listening as, if I only were to maintain eye contact 85% of the time, then I could check that box and now I'm a good listener. It changes the mentality from I'm only learning these skills and I'm going to apply them in every single case, to I'm learning a repertoire of behavior, or I'm sort of populating my toolbox so that I can pull a screwdriver out, or a hammer, or a drill, or a crowbar, or whatever kind of tool that I need in the moment, and be able to employ that tool to meet my goals and also help the person that I'm talking to meet their goals.
I wonder what that's like now in the bridging context with Listen First. When you're working with people, are there any trends or commonalities you find across the people who come to the space, the organizations who come to the space, and the way people are engaging with each other?
A friend of mine from high school that I haven't talked to this guy in, I don't know, 20 years. He called me up out of the blue and said, hey man, look, I've been listening to my local radio station, and he lives in Mobile, Alabama. And so it's a conservative radio station. He's like, and I've just, over the years have become more and more worried and fed up with the way in which they are pointing fingers at the Democrats. Now, this guy is a Republican. He's voted for Republican presidential candidates probably in almost every election, self-described conservative. And he's concerned because the ways in which they're dehumanizing Democrats simply because of a difference in belief or a difference in opinion. And he said, and I was looking for some resources, and I noticed the Listen First project, and I saw your picture, so I called you. And so I've started to invite him to some events. And so he experienced a couple of different organizations. And he gave me a call. I don't know, this was probably about 6-8 weeks ago. And he said that he was disappointed in a particular event, mainly because he did not have a chance to fully understand the political affiliations and ideologies of the people in the room. It was more about connecting and unearthing common values and these kinds of connective or relationship building. And that was the purpose of that conversation. What he wanted was an opportunity to deeply deliberate an issue, and to do that in a setting where he knew that the people he was talking to were different shades of red and blue. And so this goes to a tension that I think you'll find in this work that doesn't have to be a tension, but it can be, which is sort of dialogue and deliberation. And of course, you've got schools of thought that say you can't have deliberation without some form of dialogue or relationship building beforehand. And then, of course, you've got schools of thought that said, no, you don't necessarily have to do a whole lot of dialogue. You can just kind of bring people into a room like America in One Room, feed them hundreds of pages of deliberative, stuff beforehand, and then stick them in a Marriott for 3 days, and they'll come out with, more consensus-based solutions and so forth. And of course, that's a very bad summary of deliberative work, but let's just go with it, right? So there's this tension with how much time needs to be spent on building relationships with people who see the world differently, and getting to the work of acting together despite those differences.
In addition to different approaches, there's also a time commitment there, and not everyone can do that, right?
Deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, requires people to take time away from their job, from their family, from their extracurricular activities, and put it toward doing the work of what we ultimately elect people to do right for us. And the fact that the trust is eroding exponentially with our elected officials and our government institutions and our institutions of democracy means that we might need to find ways in our local communities, in our states, in our nation to allow people the opportunity for deliberation without them sacrificing, their livelihood or sacrificing their families or sacrificing, their, running 30 minutes a day or whatever they do for exercise, right? The degree to which we can actually expect the kinds of people that we need to be in the room to show up, not because they're not interested, but because they simply don't have the capacity to do that.
Are there any other stories you can think of that stand out to you as you've done this work?
I've seen grown men cry, and that's not to, throw out a big, gender-based stereotype bombshell and leave, but the work that is listening deeply to another person, being present for another person, and like honestly reflecting on why you believe what you believe in conversation with someone that sees the world differently or views the world or experiences the world differently than you is life-changing. I've had 60-year-old men who have come up to me after some training in listening intelligence, said, like, if I had met you 20 years ago, I would still be married. Or if I'd met you 10, 15 years ago, I would have a better relationship with my kids. So all that to say that this isn't just about having better conversations about politics or being able to talk to your, racist Uncle Henry at Thanksgiving. I mean, those things are important. But what's more important is that people can establish and maintain and transform those very relationships in their lives that are mentally and physically health-wise beneficial to them. So having a close network of people that you can turn to when you need them for emotional or physical needs, driving you to the hospital or helping with childcare or whatever, those tangible needs and those emotional needs, having that network of people you can turn to is vitally important. And so it's building community, and not just for the sake of now we can all sing Kumbaya around the campfire, which might be nice sometimes to be able to do. That's not the point. But the point is to live in a beautifully diverse world with beautifully diverse experiences and perspectives in a way that acknowledges and appreciates those perspectives for what they are, and allows those perspectives to come into conversation when they need to come into conversation so that we can act together. This is life-changing work. It's not just changing politics. It's not just changing voting habits. It's not just creating purple spaces. It's life-changing work.
You just described the world that I want as well. Thank you to my guest, Graham Bodie, Chief Listening Officer with Listen First. To learn more and sign the Listen First pledge, go to americatalks.us. Music in this episode includes Spring Fling by Track Tribe and The Heist by Silent Partner. In addition to hearing News in Context every Friday at 8:30 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. on KSFP 102.5 in San Francisco, you can hear it on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, iHeartMedia, Google Play, Google Podcasts, Podbean, YouTube, and PRX. We're also on Facebook and Twitter at News in Context SF and on Instagram at News in Context. And you can find links to all of that at newsincontext.net.